welcome to Tramlines, a podcast from Agrii. I'm your host, Tony Smith, putting your questions to the experts. Today we are joined by Tom Land, National Fertiliser Manager at Agrii, and Peter Scott, Technical Director at Origin Soil Nutrition. The focus for this episode of Tramlines is crop nutrition, with a particular focus on phosphate and potash usage, how to optimise the return on investment, and ensure that the crop can fully utilise nitrogen efficiently as well as other important nutrients. So good afternoon to you both and a very warm welcome to Tramlines. So Tom, perhaps you can set the scene. How are crops looking?
Yeah, hi Tony. Crops look in reasonably good state actually. It's a mixed basket of stages of crop, i.e. we've got growers who managed to get winter cereals in the ground early, so we've got some well-tilled crops with quite a lot of captured nitrogen in the canopy. And then also we've had a reasonably open period late autumn into the winter where growers have planted wheats relatively late. So we've got a mixture of different stages of crop this year. We've got some very forward crops and some crops that maybe need a bit more attention as we approach the application window that's ahead of us.
And good afternoon to you, Peter. How are things looking where you are?
Yeah, hi Tony. I'm speaking to you from Perthshire in the middle of Scotland. It's very similar to Tom. That we've probably had the most inclement autumn. I should touch wood in saying that as we head into spring, but we've had a more open, drier autumn than we have had for some considerable time. So particularly in the arable parts of the east of Scotland, the borders, the Lothians up through Fife into Angus and Murrayshire, Aberdeenshire, winter drillings were up in terms of acreage, and as Tom said, further south, the crops that were drilled early are looking very well, quite advanced. We've had a mild start to the winter. So going into spring, late winter, early spring, crops are generally looking very well. Starting to sort of notice, when just driving around, starting to notice some visual symptoms of crop hunger, a little bit of yellowing, which quite often at this time of year we would associate with crops standing perhaps in a bit of water. But I think a lot of it, particularly in the drier areas, is just crops starting to show a bit of hunger. We're seeing some visual symptoms of nitrogen deficiency, also sulfur and perhaps even manganese in some areas, particularly in the lighter land. But generally, the report is positive.
And whilst crops are generally looking good, what would be your concerns? What would be on your watch list? Peter, you mentioned there, starting to see a little bit of yellowing as you drive around the countryside. Tom, what are your thoughts there?
I suppose my concerns is we've had some weather patterns in between some of the early drillings and the later drillings that have been challenging, particularly down in the south of the country. We had a very wet period in the autumn, which meant growers couldn't get crops into the ground. And then all of a sudden it turned dry and crops managed to go in. And it is those weather patterns of excessively high rainfall followed by a dry spell or followed by a cold period, where that can then exacerbate and induce nutrient deficiencies probably in greater situations. The variance of weather we get seems to create more problems. And certainly that's something we learned from last year as a point in case, really.
And as you say, Tom, that the weather has such a huge impact, but what can we learn from last year? What can we learn from the results and what happened on farm? Peter?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest lessons that we keep learning, don't know how many times we could learn the same lesson, but I think it's attention to detail and getting the basics right. One of my biggest concerns, just as a general starting point in looking at crop nutrition, particularly, as Tom was alluding to, we've had, a lot of wet autumns and winters over the last few years, and where farmers haven't been keeping up to date with routine lime applications, we're seeing in some areas soil pH is dropping, and that can have a marked effect on the crop's ability to utilise and take up nutrients. So I think, that's one drum that we keep banging is, get back to basics. Check that the pH is right. Get the soil structure in good order before we start to talk about the basics of nutrition, is get those fundamentals, build up soil organic matter, get the drainage sorted. I think that's, yes, we want to develop new technologies and new, diagnostics and so on, but actually the starting point should always be the good old-fashioned basics: pH, structure, organic matter, and getting those right and in good order.
Thanks, Peter, and those are indeed regular threads of discussion here on Tramlines. Tom, what is the current trend in the use of P&K on farm?
If we look at trends and we look at the British Survey of Fertiliser Practice, we can certainly see a decline in usage of P&K, and also in statistics in terms of fertiliser purchases. Now, I don't in essence have a problem with that, because obviously, proportion of that is farmers doing the right thing and getting the best out of the nutrients they're applying. But what we are starting to see is maybe more trends around maybe things like grain concentrations of P declining. We're potentially seeing potassium deficiency in cereal crops and maize crops that we potentially haven't seen in previous years. Last year, I know it's completely different to phosphate and potassium, but last year sulfur deficiencies were rife in cereal crops, and that was a real surprising thing. But if people are making decisions on reducing key nutrients based upon an economic decision, it's worthwhile weighing up the factors, i.e. like Peter alluded to, the basics, and then understanding where if you are going to invest in these types of fertilizers, where the greatest response comes, i.e. those backward crops, those crops that are going to be probably more limited, i.e. in terms of root system, and maybe more prone to suffering the effects of variable weather conditions.
And so, Tom, what can we do to enhance those root systems of those crops, and also to enable the crop to be more resilient with this variable weather?
Well, certainly what we see in previous years where weather conditions continue to challenge us, late spring, is if that crop hasn't built an adequate root system, then all of a sudden, extreme dry spells impede things like N uptake from fertilizers that are applied, but also particularly the crop has a higher demand sometimes for things like potassium from the soil, as you've got a root system and a plant trying to pull potassium up from the soil. So, i.e. building that root system is really important, particularly early season. So you've got something there that can help mitigate, the variability of the weather that might be thrown at us. So certainly in terms of farmers thinking, is certainly looking to see what they can do to improve establishment. And obviously we're seeing more people adopting things like, drills with fertilizer placement kits on, but also identifying crops that may be of key concern. These nice and forward early drilled wheats have probably got a really good root system. They're going to have an end demand, of course, but their ability to extract nutrients from the soil is going to be a lot better than maybe something that's later drilled, smaller root system, and probably needs a bit more attention. And certainly, we've got some interesting data where we've looked at potassium uptake in a dry season, and we've measured this in things in the straw, because predominantly most of the K is in the straw come harvest. And in years where there's greater crop stress induced by weather, potassium uptake is a lot higher, because the plant is in essence under stress and demanding more water, thus pulling up things like potassium and nitrogen. So you can't predict the weather, but you can certainly prepare for what might be coming ahead, and that's where identifying your potential risks. If you're thinking of making an economic decision, then maybe mitigate those risks where the risk is probably going to be greater, i.e. by investing in maybe spring top dressing or early spring top dressing of things like potassium, things like that, really.
For more information and useful articles on crop nutrition, visit agrii.co.uk/nutrition. And Peter, what else do we need to consider? What else do we need to get right when it comes to crop nutrition?
None of the nutrients actually operate or work in isolation. It's a network of interactions, of synergies and antagonisms. And a classic one is the synergy between nitrogen and sulfur. So to optimize grain protein content and quality, we need a certain ratio of nitrogen to sulfur. So in the case of cereals, typically we'd be looking at an optimum level of no greater of 12 parts nitrogen to 1 part sulfur. And that's absolutely vital, because the presence of the sulfur helps with the uptake of nitrogen into the plant, but then even more importantly, helps with that conversion of nitrogen into protein. So sulfur is a key building block of amino acids, true proteins. So in terms of driving up that nitrogen uptake and then the subsequent conversion into protein, it's absolutely critical. I was actually speaking to a farmer at Lama last month who said to me that he was growing Skyfall, struggling to hit his protein targets, and was throwing more and more nitrogen at it, and was up to 270 kilograms a hectare of nitrogen last year and still didn't hit his protein targets. So I asked him how much sulfur he was applying, and he said, should I be applying sulfur? And I think that's a classic example of where actually, I'm not hitting my targets. We talk about grain protein probably too casually as being grain nitrogen, but it's not grain nitrogen in isolation. It's that combination or ratio of nitrogen to sulfur that's going to optimize that conversion of nutrient into protein. So hopefully that farmer's gone back to rethink his approach to nitrogen and sulfur.
What can a farmer do now at this stage of the season as we're going into that busy time of year?
Yeah, so for the crop that's already in the ground, and a lot of farmers at this stage, particularly those growing winter cereals, may already have fertilizer in the shed ready to go. So I think for a lot of those people, it's really looking at thinking about that nitrogen and sulfur in terms of timing, getting the right amount on at the right time, making sure that there's sufficient nitrogen on there for the start of stem extension growth stage 31 to drive that vegetative growth through the spring. And then for people that are planning, say, to drill spring crops, who maybe haven't got fertilizer purchased yet, I would certainly be encouraging those people to do some detailed planning, and i.e., doing a broad spectrum soil analysis, or acting if they've already taken a soil analysis, getting good facts advice. I think there's a danger of thinking of nutrients in isolation. In actual fact, all of these nutrients are working together in a sort of mesh, interacting mesh, and we need to do more broad spectrum soil analysis to determine the full range of nutrient requirements. Soil analysis will tell us what we think is going to happen, and then we would be encouraging farmers more and more. Tom alluded to it earlier, to actually take samples of the growing crop in season to determine, have I got that nitrogen sulfur ratio right? Am I short in potash? And then also to take a sample of the harvested grain and analyze the mineral profile, because that will tell us, as I said, the soil analysis will tell us what we expect to happen. In-season tissue analysis will tell us what is happening. But if we analyze the amount of nutrients in the harvested grain, that tells us what has happened. And if we pull all of those different analytical pieces together, it gives us a much, much more comprehensive picture of the nutritional requirement, the interactions between the different nutrients, the key mineral ratios that we touched on earlier, for example, nitrogen and sulfur, but also some of the micronutrients that maybe don't get as much attention as they merit. In terms of things like affecting nitrogen use efficiency, crop health. Whilst that doesn't maybe directly affect this current growing season, nutrient planning is a dynamic. We should be doing these analytics to inform future decisions. Once we've got that broad base of data, then we can actually create bespoke fertilizer packages. So rather than farmers relying on a fairly limited selection of different fertilizer analysis, we can do multi-nutrient prescription fertilizers to try and match the nutrient input as closely as possible to what all of those analytics are telling us.
And Tom, I think this is your core message, isn't it? Nutrient planning. I know I've heard it many times here on Tramlines.
Oh, definitely. I think, like Peter alluded to, it's the grain testing is a great retrospective look back and go what worked. And I think looking back at last year, what we learned from last season, this season is almost playing out very similar to the season before in terms of decisions we need to make. And just purely for nitrogen conversions from the soil through to the plant, we need a whole host of other elements in that process as well. And we can't just focus on one thing being able to solve all our problems here, i.e. let's throw as much nitrogen at the crop as we can and expect to have the same result when potentially there are elements that might be potentially limiting and reducing that ability to convert nitrogen and make nitrogen available.
And Tom, what else would be on your key watch list for this approaching season that farmers need to get right?
And Peter talked about sulfur. We saw so much deficiency last year by maybe reduced applications, making the fertilisers stretch because they only had so much in the shed. We certainly know there's a bigger winter cereal acreage in the ground this year, and that would be an element where you would immediately see a deficiency very quickly, in regardless of soil type and situation these days. So making sure that if you have not got enough sulfur to achieve the right amount of sulfur for the year, then that would probably be somewhere where I'd be thinking about maybe getting some more in stock ready for the forthcoming application ready.
Thanks, Tom. And as always, as we come towards the end of this podcast, we ask for some top tips. So perhaps, Tom, you could start us off. What would be your top tip that you would urge those listening today to consider?
Well, first off is visual inspection of crops. That's the easiest thing you can do, and most growers will. Most growers will have a handle on the growth stage and the size of their crops. There are other things you can think about as well. There's obviously the good old prevailing weather, but also people may be thinking about nitrogen applications, what fertiliser they have in the shed, what choice of product, how much product they're going to apply. It is only the 12th of February today. There's still plenty more winter that could be thrown at us. And actually, how much N a crop is physically going to utilise at these very early stages. We are reliant on soil temperatures warming up, i.e. to help mineralisation and conversion of N. But certainly in my focus and top tip is maybe prioritise those more backward crops that look hungrier.
And Peter, what would be your top tips? Perhaps thinking about the particular part of the world where you are based.
Tom was just talking there, I think primarily about crops that are already in the ground. What I would just as an adjunct to that, maybe for people that are planning to sow spring crops from probably middle of next month onwards, would to have that plan if they've not got a recent soil analysis, to get a soil analysis done. It's not too late. That gives us a good basis to plan the right nutrition for spring barley, spring oats, and legumes, and spend a little bit of time and effort on establishing the right fertilizer for those spring crops, because the wrong fertilizer is the most expensive fertilizer, and as a Scotsman, that's true to my heart. I would encourage that for people that are planning ahead, over the next few weeks to be drilling spring crops. If you haven't already done a soil analysis, do a broad spectrum analysis and take a multi-nutrient approach, and if possible, and obviously this will depend on machinery and so on and circumstances, whether people are using contracts or so, but I'm a great believer in combine drilling and placing nutrients for spring crops beside in the seed bed. And if that's not possible, then incorporating, so broadcasting straight after drilling and harrowing that nutrient into the seed bed to get the crops off to the best possible start.
Thank you, Tom and Peter. Some key thoughts there for crop nutrition for this growing season. That's it for this podcast, but do tune in again as we meet the experts throughout the season, exploring the many immediate and longer-term questions for growers and farmers in the UK. If you have any questions that you would like us to ask the experts, email info@agrii.co.uk. See you next time.